Hi there, everybody. This is Jake Smirchna. This is my project number one for EDAD 833. What we're doing in this assignment, as you all know, is talking about how test scores are presented and some of the procedures and interpretations of those scores. As you guys all know, what we're kind of doing here is looking at things from a leader standpoint, an administrator standpoint, if you will, and relaying things to a staff. So that's kind of what we're doing here, and what we'll be looking at in terms of these administrative ideas and in the way we report our test scores is we'll be looking at, in no particular order, we'll be looking at percentiles, we'll be looking at grade equivalent scores, standard scores, NCEs, which has to do with our normal curve that we see, STANINES, scale scores, and raw scores, which are correlated but different, and then just what norms are in general. So as a principal or an administrator kind of preparing people, I'd want us to know what I mean when I say norm reference testing, which is kind of what Popham is looking at in chapter 13 and what this project's all about. So just for some frame of reference, when we talk about ability reference testing, what we're talking about there is how are students doing in the scope of how good could they be doing in terms of their abilities. That falls probably not often in your classrooms as teachers a lot, but it is a style of test. Growth reference is a type of test we're probably going to see a lot. I mean, this is the kind of things where you'd have kids take a test 3 times in a year and see how their reading comprehension improves. At Fremont Public Schools, for me, we do MAPS testing where they take it in 3rd and 5th and 7th, and you see how they're growing in those different fields of mathematics and scientific problem solving. Criterion reference testing is just us evaluating what can students do or not do. And then last but not least, when we talk about this project and norm reference testing, we're comparing how a student did on an assessment or a performance test or an achievement test in terms of everyone else, and in terms of what's average, what is the average typical 14-year-old doing, or whatever the case might be here, okay? So again, just building on that idea, what we're looking at in norm referenced interpretations is how other students have done on this previously. And again, usually other students, but it can also be one student taking it many times. So that's where we get a lot of these rankings. So we'll go through some examples here, but these are just two little examples of us comparing how a student did on a test to the norm, to everyone else in his grade, to everyone else in their school, to everyone else in their class of 50, to everyone else in the country, to the whole state of Nebraska. And one of the things I want to make sure we keep coming back to as administrators is that test scores, if they're valid and they're consistent and they're reliable, they're going to be used to make really, really, really important decisions in a kid's educational career. So just like I included at the bottom here, I mean, when we're looking at which students are at risk and which ones aren't at risk, and which ones should progress a grade and which ones should qualify for an honors class, we're looking at a lot of norm reference interpretations and how kids are doing in reference to their peers and others in that situation. So getting into some of these specific terms that I'd want teachers to know. I hope it's not cutting off at the bottom here. I'm already a few minutes in, but when we talk about norms as a whole in testing, what we're talking about is the normative scores for that test, and a normative coming from the word normal. So when we look at it, this is these huge samples of students, and again, if we're talking about chemistry students in a high school, we're looking at all 109 kids who are taking Unit 1 chemistry test. If we're talking about the ACT, we're talking about all the 50,000 kids in the Midwest taking the ACT. And what we then do is we kind of lay out that data, and that allows us to look at the norm and look at, well, where are most kids falling in terms of scores here? And the classic bell curve, it fits this perfectly because it really starts to look at, well, not very many kids are scoring over here, and a lot of kids are scoring in the middle here, which again gets us to that idea of the norm. And then again, we have wide ends of that spectrum there, but that's what we're talking about when we say norms. And it's really important as teachers and as administrators, we're clarifying who is it we're talking about. Are we talking about kids in our school district, our state, our nation, our country, our school? I mean, we all know that schools in the same town can be very different. So it's very important that we classify what it is that norm is. Raw scores is one I put first because it's a lot of times what we'll get. And as Popham himself says, a raw score is simply put, it's the number of questions or items a kid gets right. And usually it's the number out of the number possible. So If there are 25 questions on a test and a kid gets 15, his raw score would be 15. There's no conversions, there's no scaling, there's no fluffing, there's no comparing him to everyone else. His raw score is truly just his observed score. Now, usually we'll take this as teachers and we might often put it into a pool of data to evaluate, did too many kids fail, did too many kids, whatever the case might be, but raw scores are almost always what we'll start with. And again, it's important we understand what that's being used for in testing. Building into that, a lot of times what we'll talk about is scale scores, and this is probably much more applicable to the real world and things that we'll see. Scaled score is when we talk about what a student's raw score or a person's raw score might be, and what it is then is converted onto some type of consistent standardized scale nationwide. A great example of this, like I included here, is a lot of the high stakes exams like the ACT or the MCAT for medical school, and even the SAT. On the ACT, a kid might get a 31 on a reading section. That doesn't mean he got 31 questions right. It means we took the number he got right out of 40 questions and converted it back to that idea of that norm to figure out where it would convert to a 31 on a scale of 36. So, there's a lot of place in testing for scale scores. It's used in a lot of standardized testing, and it's often used to compare different things. And again, going back to the ACT, we know that the 40 reading questions on the April ACT are much different than the 40 reading questions on the September ACT, but we need to have kids have scores that are comparable, and a lot of times we do that through scale scores. So it's used a lot of times to really assess how difficult tests are, and it kind of is a built-in variable for how we report that. But again, it starts with raw scores, and the way that we scale it is an important part as teachers and us justifying, well, how are we scaling this to whatever that number might be for that kid based on their raw score. Percentiles are something many teachers are probably a lot more familiar with because it's something we use in class, but percentiles is another true sense of what norm testing is. And what it is it's taking a student's results on their test and it's interpreting it as a percentage of a whole population. So if a student scores in the 71st percentile, what that means is that they scored higher than 71% of students in the national norm group. Just today, actually, our daughter, who's 4 days old, had her first pediatric doctor appointment, and she tested in the 3rd percentile for her head size. She's very, very little, which means that out of 100 kids, she has the 3rd biggest head in the average scale of the way that children develop. Very, very important for teachers at the bottom here. When we talk about percentiles, a lot of parents, a lot of community members might misinterpret it. It is not the percent of items kids get correct. It is how we measure as a whole how they're doing compared to others. So if a kid scores in the 71st percentile, that does not mean they got a 71%. It means they're scoring better than 70% of their peers. I included it, I think it's cut off here, but Popham and some of the authors talk a little bit about how the intervals are not equal. There is a huge jump going from the 90th percentile to the 95th percentile versus from the 55th to the 60th percentile. And that goes back to the idea of that bell curve. In the middle, when we have a lot of that meat, there's obviously going to be a lot more room for percentiles to be used and expressed as a portion of the whole for a student's test score. Grade equivalent scores. I mean, and speaking of parents' misinterpretation, GCEs are sometimes another thing that are used a lot. But what these do is they compare where a student is right now to other kids taking the same test at a different grade level. And that's kind of a weirdly worded thing to say, but for us as teachers, this might come out as a 5th grader receives a 10.5 on a standardized math test. What this means is that 5th grader is doing questions as well as a 10th grader in the 5th month of school would be doing at that same material. So it is really important we do not interpret this as this 5th grader should be in 10th grade, because that's not the case at all. And that's a lot of times how it's used. And there's a lot of place for grade equivalent scores, and it's used a lot of times looking at kids' progress in schools and how those things might go. It's very, very communicable in terms of what we're trying to show and how kids are growing, but it's very, very misinterpreted by a lot of the general public. Standard scores, oftentimes z-scores again, and what we're really starting to see here, I mean, you've seen this bell-shaped curve a lot, but what we're looking at here is one student's individual performance and how they are in comparison to the same age or same grade peers. We're not looking at how other grades do. We're looking at other kids in their age level and how their abilities compare to each other. So a lot of times it has to do with the mean, and then statistically we talk a lot of times about standard deviations, and what those are intervals from what our mean might be. So if you go look right here, you know, if a student, here's our average score, if they're scoring something over here, their z-score would be -1, meaning that they're one standard deviation below what the average fourth grader might be scoring on this test. So again, this whole idea of this z-score is us taking large populations and saying, hey, this one individual kid, are they well below grade level? Are they really, really below what other kids in their grade are doing? Are they slightly above or really above? This is something that I think can probably be used a lot in when we're making honors class decisions at the high school level, and just how kids are doing in class as a whole compared to other kids the same age. Last couple here, when we look at normal curves, I think I accidentally said NCE on a slide before, but this whole idea of normal curves is very, very similar to percentiles. It's slightly different in the way that we scale it, but it is a way of measuring where students fall along a normal curve. And again, it's 0 to 100. I think it's a little bit cut off here, but these are really started to be used in districts when we're talking about common assessments across many subjects, or many times using the same assessment from 2018 to 2019 to 2020. And what it does then is it gives us this whole NCE score, and I think it's almost cut off here, but what it does is instead of us measuring how many standard deviations away it is, it's measuring, well, hey, out of all the kids who've taken this test, where does it fall in terms of that norm? And again, it is pretty similar to percentages as a whole, but it's much more equally intervaled. And a lot of times what it's really used for, like I put up here, it was originally used for Title I programs and measuring how well they were doing, but it's a lot more equal intervals across the board, whereas percentages have standard deviations that vary in the amount of students that fall in between there. Last but not least here, this was one, you're not probably going to see this a lot, but it's another scale that we'll use. It's called STANINES, and what that's short for is standards nines. And instead of using all these big percentages and random ACT scores of 36 and stuff, it truly was a scale that was created based on a scale of 1 through 9. And you guys can see here that it just breaks it down into intervals that are not equal in terms of how students fall into those. And again, it really starts to help us understand our kids currently, in terms of reading comprehension, below average, and again, you can see how the scales are not different. We have way more students score a 5 than we do a 1 or a 9. But again, I think these sorry, baby fatigue setting in. STANINES are they're another way for us to represent data and where a student might fall. And again, when you look at how it falls straight down the line here in terms of normal curve equivalents and national percentiles, it's another scale that we'll use. And like always with all this as teachers, I mean, coming into my reference slide here, as teachers, the important thing that we're doing across the board here is constantly making sure we understand the way that a test score we're measuring or that we're getting from a kid's standardized test is being published and understood correctly. We don't want parents getting their 5th grader's report card and thinking that their kid should be in 10th grade, because that's usually not the case. And again, reiterating what I said at the start, we want to make decisions for kids' academic careers based on data, and we need to use that well. And when we look at what does it take for the average 9th grader to move into 10th grade in English, that's a fairly nationwide average and statewide Nebraska average when we look at our state objectives and our learning goals. And a lot of times, in order for us to evaluate that as class teachers, as schools, we look at what's called the norm, and that's where we compare things as a whole to other students in their grade, other students in their class, other students in the state, or whatever the case might be. So we just need to understand who that norm is and how you guys as teachers should present that properly. So appreciate everyone listening. Hopefully my sleepless daddy days this week with our newborn didn't set in too much, but have a great week, everybody.